From omens to Romans to Civil War reenactments, this island is awash with the armies of old. I'm Matt, and this is the Spectred Isle. Welcome to the Spectred Isle, a channel dedicated to the myths, mysteries and malcontents that inhabit these great isles of Britain. Today I'll be discussing a phenomenon that has been reported throughout history, even at one stage being entered into official public record by an actual king. That is of course the multitude of sightings across the country of ghost armies. So let's dim the lights, these lights don't dim, light a few candles, close the curtains and get snug under a blanket as we explore the first of many Spectred Isle ghost stories. So to begin with, what are ghosts? I genuinely hope there isn't somebody who needs me to answer that question. Everyone knows what a ghost is, and if you don't, what are you doing? But what are the different types of ghosts? Ghosts as we know them come in all sorts of shapes and forms, from the insubstantial like orbs, poltergeists and funnel ghosts, through to ones with a bit more shape to them such as wraiths, fetches, shades, banshees, revenants and so on. One of the more common types of ghost, and the type we would associate most with the ghost armies that I'm about to discuss, is the residual haunting, also known as a looper, or in the case of the Supernatural TV series, a death echo. These are spirits that are completely unaware of their current surroundings and unable to interact with anything or anyone nearby. Instead, they exist as a memory, trapped in whatever moment their physical environment was and replaying that moment over and over again. Sometimes it could be their death, sometimes it could be a significant event that they were involved in. Often these hauntings happen at specific times, generally the anniversary of or the actual time of the thing that they are reenacting took place, which crops up in several of the examples that I'll be discussing. Do enough research and you'll find a lot of examples of these, so I've chosen my favourite few to share with you and speculate on. While I looked through several sources to get the information on these sightings, I do want to highlight two resources in particular, especially for those who are interested in further reading. One is the Paranormal Database. It's not quite as encyclopedic as other folklore or paranormal websites might be, but what lacks in details it more than makes up for in quantity of accounts, boasting over 14,000 entries gathered by the website team themselves, but also individual members of the public, meaning it boasts the record of the most local personal stories instead of just focusing on the more famous ones. The second is a book by Dr. Simon Marsden, which explores ghost stories throughout England's key heritage sites, called This Spectred Isle. Now, I know what you're thinking, I must have stolen the name of my channel from the name of this book. Honestly, that is not true. After I set up the channel and did all the bits that I needed to, I then decided to Google Spectred Isle and this book showed up, and at first I thought, somebody's already thought of this, damn it. And then I thought, cool, a ghost book that I haven't heard of. And then I bought it and then I moved on, so let's all just move on. Clearly, Dr. Marsden and I both realised that the moniker This Spectred Isle from Richard II, that describes the historical significance of the English throne, can be punified into spectred to describe ghosts and stuff. A genuine, total coincidence from two people who clearly love flowery language. Right, on to the sightings, and I wasn't sure what order to do this in, so I figured chronologically from the first reported sighting would make the most sense. That takes us way back to September 1602, and to the local chronicler Robert Parry. He was known as a travelling poet from Wales who specialised in writing romances. Apparently the sighting was recorded in his diary, which I can't find a record of anywhere, but a translation of it appears in the Archaeologia Cambrensis, so probably a good thing that I couldn't find his original diary because I don't speak Welsh anyway. He states in his diary that the apparition happened at Nanny Frith, This is a valley near to the village of Bulcgwyn, the highest village in Wales, and home to a very beautiful woodland area with a stream and a waterfall that just looks like it's out of a fantasy setting. The translation itself is written in typical ye olde style you'd see at a Renaissance fair, so I'll pop it on screen, but I will read it like a normal person would, albeit in a different voice to try and add more gravitas. About this time in Nanny Frith, between Trethin and Wrexham, at the edge of the evening, was seen around 2,000 or 3,000 armed men on horseback, displaying banners, marching in a warlike manner. It must have been some kind of apparition or forewarning, and yet it was verified by 8 or 9 people. Some of them credit that they all jointly saw the same thing. There's a bit where he says, "Whereas indeed there was no such thing but some apparition or forewarning of likelihood." I think what he's saying there is there shouldn't have been an actual physical army there, in the sense that military movements at the time meant no real army would have any need to be there, so it must have been an apparition. Oddly, despite him never having described the army beyond being on horseback and holding banners, later retellings of the story theorised that this was a ghostly Roman army using a long buried Roman trackway in the area. 2 issues I have with that. For one, only a portion of a Roman legion would ever have been on horseback, and even though there are some records of armies with majority cavalries, there's no way an entire unit would have been mounted. Secondly, while there is some evidence of Roman activity in the area, Parry makes a point that it seemed more like a premonition or foretelling, and 40 years later, the Wrexham and East Denbighshire area did see some significant military traffic during the English Civil War. Were Parry and his 8 or 9 fellow eyewitnesses being given a glimpse of the bloody horrors the mid-17th century would bring? I guess we'll never know. You know I like interjecting with fun observations that I've had during my research, and the sentence prior to this passage in Parry's diary mentions that it was around this time his brother's son was born, and he was given the remarkably cruel name of Harry Parry. Anyway, since we're discussing the Civil War, let's go into detail of the next sighting and do the briefest of history lessons while we're at it. The causes of the English Civil War and the wider conflict involving the other British countries known as the War of Three Kingdoms are very complex, but in the shortest possible explanation, there were arguments about how much power the church should have, how much power the king should have, and how the economy should have been handled. This was during a lengthy period in British history where Parliament was gradually getting more powerful and the absolute authority of the monarchy was diminishing. A trio of wars took place between 1642 and 1651, with up to 200,000 people, just under 5% of the UK population at the time, dying as a result, one of which was the king himself. The monarchy was abolished, only for it to be restored 11 years later. Many of England's mighty castles were ruined, and even Christmas was banned for 15 to 16 years, so overall, not the best time. Anyway, back to ghosts. The first major battle of the war was that of Edge Hill in October 1642. Happening almost by accident because the royalists and parliamentarians just happened to stumble across each other while the former were marching on London, it was an evenly fought battle with no real outright victor. Both armies were made up of mostly conscripted or volunteer peasants, and while the royalists had the more experienced cavalry, the parliamentarians, otherwise known as the Roundheads, were better equipped. Over 1,000 troops died in that battle, another 3,000 injured, many of which likely succumbed to their wounds given the hygiene at the time. As was the way of things, the bodies of the dead were just left on the field of battle and only attended to by looters and carrion. Nobody batted an eyelid at this practice, except that 2 months later some shepherds walking across the battlefield began to hear the clash of swords, the screams of horses and the wails of dying men. They saw nothing on the battlefield itself, but when looking upwards, they saw the ghosts of dead men recreating the battle above them. The shepherds contacted a local priest who also saw it, and many others began to report it as well, so much so that the locals published a pamphlet about it the next year. The stories made their way into the ears of the king, who sent a royal commission to go and check it out. The commission also witnessed the event, but they also say they recognised several of the ghostly men as ones they knew had died in the battle. Because they had to file their report with the Public Record Office, and in that report acknowledged seeing the event, these ghostly soldiers became official public record and remain the only ghosts ever granted that status in English history. After a few months of this event being witnessed on a nightly basis, the locals decided to give all of the troops a proper Christian burial, and this seemed to put an end to the event. However, some say, on a dark night on Edge Hill, even to this day, if you listen carefully, the sounds of swords, horses and cannons can still be heard across the old battlefield. From an undecisive battle to a highly decisive one, 3 years later, in 1645, the Battle of Naseby took place, which saw any hopes of a royalist victory utterly shattered and paved the way for what would eventually become Charles I's surrender and execution. The detailed stories about this one are scarce, beyond the event being similar to that of Edge Hill. Every year, on the 14th of June, the anniversary of the battle, the sounds of swords clashing, men dying and cannons firing can be heard on the battlefield, and in the sky above, a ghostly reenactment of the battle is played out. Reports suggest that this was such a common annual occurrence that the locals would literally walk out to the field to sit and watch the spectacle take place, and it allegedly happened for 100 straight years until it just stopped. This tracks with the fact that there aren't any reports of modern sightings. However, the Northampton Paranormal Group did go up there on the anniversary in 2008, and they managed to grab this picture that they believe shows a ghostly figure of a soldier coming out from the trees. Next on my list, we jump almost a century forward to Midsummer's Eve 1735. The location of the story changes depending on the source, but generally it is either on or around Blencathra, a summit in the Cumbrian Mountains, or outside Penrith Castle, which lies about 12 miles to the east. Penrith Castle was built at the end of the 14th century to protect the town Penrith from being ransacked by Scots, a common historical occurrence before then. In the mid to late 15th century, it was the home of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would eventually go on to be Richard III, and after that, briefly in 1648, it was the headquarters of General John Lambert of the Roundheads during the Civil War. The story goes that on this warm midsummer night, either a servant or farmer, again depending on the source, witnessed an army of cavalry and foot soldiers marching across the fell. He told his story to locals and they didn't believe him. The castle had been unoccupied for almost a century and there was no military movements nearby, so he was brushed off. 2 years later, the servant's master and members of his family, again on Midsummer's Eve, witnessed the same event, stating that the line was 5 men deep and the mounted units were officers. Again, nobody believed this either. Then 8 years later, on Midsummer's Eve 1745, 26 individual people remarked on seeing the army, and this time it included carriages that shouldn't have been able to make it up the hill. The army was so large that the line was almost half a mile long and took hours to get over the fell. The witnesses had to swear their sightings to a magistrate because at the time the Second Jacobite Rebellion had begun. I won't go into the major details here. It was an attempt to usurp the throne that started in Scotland before moving southwards, and as such, a large group of well-armed men in Cumbria was a big deal. All of the reports on this note that with each sighting, witnesses went up to where the army had marched the morning after, but found no foot or hoof prints, no cart tracks, no evidence whatsoever that an army had ever been there. The witnesses described the men as looking real, not spectral or otherwise ghostly, and that's led to theories of them being flashes of another dimension. Or perhaps this was the spectral army commonly known as the Wild Hunt, an omen of war that may have been increasing in size the closer the country approached its next conflict. But the Wild Hunt is too fascinating to not do a separate video on, so you will need to wait for that. Another time jump now to the early 19th century when, in July 1812, the Leeds Mercury newspaper ran with this article. Cattleman Anthony Jackson and a young boy in his employ were on Haverah Park in Yorkshire when, at around 7 to 8 in the evening, they saw an apparition. According to the report, the young boy, William Turner, shouted, "Look, Anthony, what a quantity of beast!" To which the older gent replied, "Beast? Lord bless us, they are not beasts, they are men." What they witnessed was a ghostly army of hundreds of men, all dressed in white uniforms, with some sort of commander in the middle wearing scarlet. They began marching towards the summit of a hill, and when they reached it, another much larger army, dressed in dark clothes, appeared and marched after them, though apparently not in a hostile way. As they began marching away, a thick smoke covered the plain, so much so that the two men couldn't even see the cattle in front of them. When it finally cleared, the armies had gone. It's an unusual one because before the comment about the commander in the Second Army, you would assume that the white uniforms were because they were ghosts. But that's undone by the scarlet commander and the dark coloured clothing of the second unit. What then could they have been? Standard uniforms for armies in England didn't exist until the Civil War, and even then, the uniforms chosen were red. There was a brief period where the Scottish army wore grey, but otherwise British armies didn't introduce fully light colours until well after this apparition occurred. And in the meantime, when white was present, it was as an accent or just the breeches, not the full uniform. Could this have been another vision or omen? Maybe some militaristic version of the Wild Hunt? Nobody knows. It is interesting that many of the ghostly armies reported over the centuries are all in relation to that particular war. It was certainly a gruesome and defining war in the history of England, but this is a nation steeped in the blood of battle, many of which have been far more costly. So why the Civil War? There's a lot of ghost stories in the USA about lone Civil War soldiers or ghostly battle reenactments and the like. Maybe the power of countrymen against countrymen, brother against brother, a battle of identities as to what patriotism really means, just has more of an impact on the soul and means its metaphysical scars are much more likely to linger on. As I said earlier as well, residual hauntings are normally caused by a spirit replaying a significant moment in their life, usually their death, but sometimes a really impactful event. One of the outcomes of the Civil War was the creation of a standing army for England, instead of having to rely on levying feuds. So the war itself was mostly fought by these farmers, servants, peasants who are forced to pick up their scythes and axes, put on their sturdiest clothes and march into battle. It's one thing for a fully equipped, well-trained career soldier to have to face the fear of fighting and even dying in battle, but for an average citizen it must have been absolutely terrifying. So no wonder the emotional, existential resonance of such an event would cause your soul to keep returning to it for the rest of time. And there are a couple of other stories about ghostly armies that I would have included in this video, but I think warrant their own. One is the Treasurer's House in York, probably the UK's most famous ghost army story, to be honest, but it's just one of several ghostly tales in that particular house, and one of a lot of stories in York itself. So I'm thinking a York specific video, even a Treasurer's House specific video, will be done sometime in the future. The other is the myth found in several places around the UK about the resting place of King Arthur and his army, who sleep until they are called upon to save England once again. As with the other, this warrants its own video. I'm planning on doing a series of some of my favourite short mythological stories. Have a break from the otherwise meticulously researched and overly long videos that will make up the bulk of this channel, and that tale is one I will definitely be doing. But still, that concludes my roundup of some of the tales of ghostly armies from across the UK. We've seen omens of war to come, reflections of wars once fought, and possibly glimpses of another timeline of wars that could have been. Naturally, it's up to you whether you choose to believe in these mysterious ghost armies or not, but as I always say, a world bereft of magic and mystery is a boring world to live in. Stay safe, stay sane, have a good one.